He stood alone in a courtroom where the verdict seemed decided before the trial even began. Surrounded by smirks, whispers, and quiet laughter, he wasn't treated like a man, he was treated like a message. Every look carried judgment. Every moment pressed him lower. They believed they knew exactly who he was, what he deserved, and how far his life could go. What they didn't know was that this case wasn't ordinary, and neither was he, because by the time the truth surfaced, the people mocking him would wish they had stayed silent. And when that truth finally came out, everything changed. Before that day, his life followed a quiet, disciplined rhythm that rarely drew attention. He woke before sunrise, exercised out of habit, not vanity, and dressed with intention. To the outside world, he was just another professional navigating long hours and constant pressure. Few people knew the depth of responsibility he carried or the weight of decisions he made behind closed doors. Fewer still knew his name. That anonymity was intentional. Power, he believed, worked best when it stayed unseen. He valued routine because it grounded him. Morning coffee, headlines scanned without emotion. A long drive filled with thought instead of music. He had spent decades earning his place through restraint, precision, and patience in systems that were never designed with men like him in mind. He learned early that excellence didn't protect you from suspicion and often invited it. Still, he believed in institutions even when they failed him, especially when they failed him. The incident that followed didn't begin with chaos. It started with something small, procedural, and dismissive, a misunderstanding layered with assumption, a moment where authority leaned on bias instead of facts. By the time the courtroom date arrived, the narrative had already been shaped without him. To those involved, he wasn't a respected professional or a leader with decades of service. He was simply a black man who, in their eyes, needed to be put in his place as he walked into court that morning. He felt the familiar tension he'd carried his entire life, the unspoken awareness that respect was conditional. The room didn't see his record. It didn't see his sacrifice. It only saw what it expected to see. And no one there realized that the quiet man standing before them held a truth powerful enough to expose far more than their prejudice. The tension didn't erupt all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as procedure, hiding behind badges, paperwork, and authority. From the moment the case was assigned, the imbalance was clear. Reports were written with certainty, but without care. Details that could have helped him were ignored, while assumptions were treated like facts. The narrative had already been sealed, long before anyone stepped into the courtroom. By the time the hearing began, the atmosphere felt heavy and hostile. The officers involved carried themselves with relaxed confidence, the kind that comes from knowing the system usually bends in their favor. Their body language spoke louder than words, smirks exchanged, eyes rolling, heads shaking in disbelief that this man had the audacity to challenge them. To them, this wasn't about justice. It was about dominance as evidence was presented. Small inconsistencies surfaced, but they were brushed aside with indifference. Timelines didn't align. Procedures weren't followed. Yet none of it seemed to matter. Each mistake was reframed as irrelevant. Each concern was minimized. The more he sat there, the clearer it became that the process wasn't designed to protect him. It was designed to pressure him to submission. The humiliation grew subtle but deliberate. His background was reduced to stereotypes. His professionalism was questioned without cause. His composure was treated as suspicion rather than restraint. Every time he remained calm, it was interpreted as arrogance. Every time he stayed silent, it was framed as guilt. The room fed off this imbalance, growing more comfortable as his dignity was chipped away piece by piece. What made it worse was his awareness. He understood exactly what was happening. He had seen this pattern before, studied it, documented it, fought against it from the inside of institutions most people never get access to. But in this moment, none of that protected him. Titles meant nothing if no one believed you deserved them. Experience meant nothing when bias filled in the gaps. The officers pushed harder, confident they were untouchable. Their accounts became more theatrical, more exaggerated, as if performing for an audience that had already chosen sides. Each claim leaned further into caricature, painting him as defiant, aggressive, and uncooperative. The irony was cruel. His silence, his discipline, his restraint were being used against him. Around him, the room felt smaller. Time seemed to slow, stretching each second into something heavier. The weight of generations pressed down on his chest, the unspoken understanding that men who looked like him had stood in rooms like this before, hoping fairness would prevail, only to be proven wrong. He could feel the judgment before any decision was made. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A document was referenced casually, almost carelessly. Something the officers clearly hadn't expected to matter. A detail they assumed no one would verify. The energy in the room flickered just slightly, like a light threatening to go out. For the first time, uncertainty crossed their faces. Still, they laughed it off. Confidence returned quickly. They believed they were in control. They believed the man before them had no power, no leverage, no way to turn the situation around. What they didn't realize was that every misstep, every exaggerated claim, every moment of disrespect was building towards something they could no longer stop. As the hearing continued, the foundation beneath their certainty began to crack. Not enough for them to notice yet, but enough that the truth was inching closer to the surface. And when it did, it wouldn't just challenge their version of events. It would expose something far bigger than a single case, forcing everyone in that room to confront the cost of their assumptions. The room reached a breaking point when the final review began. What had started as quiet humiliation now tightened into something heavier, almost dangerous. The officers' confidence hardened into irritation as their authority was questioned, even subtly. Their posture stiffened. Their expressions sharpened. This was the moment when power, once comfortable, felt threatened. The man at the center of it all felt the shift immediately. The air seemed thinner, the silence louder. He understood what this moment meant. If the system closed ranks now, the truth would never surface. His reputation would be buried beneath accusations carefully shaped to sound reasonable. His life's work would be reduced to a footnote in a case built on assumption. He had seen this ending before, and like him, it often didn't get a second chapter. Every procedural error was suddenly reframed as intentional defiance. Every unanswered question became proof of guilt. The injustice was no longer subtle. It was bold, almost reckless, as if they believed no consequence could touch them. The room mirrored that belief. No urgency, no outrage. Just quiet acceptance of a familiar imbalance. Then the turning point arrived, not with noise, but with clarity. Documentation that could no longer be ignored was brought forward. Credentials verified. Records cross-checked. The very systems that had failed him were now being forced to acknowledge him. The shift was immediate and undeniable. Faces that once carried smug certainty froze. Smiles vanished. The confidence that had filled the room drained away in real time. For the first time, the officers looked unsure. Their body language changed, betraying an unspoken fear. They realized too late that the man they had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was not powerless. He wasn't cornered. He wasn't ordinary. He was someone whose reach extended far beyond that courtroom, someone whose presence there was not an accident, but a test they had already failed. The emotional weight of the moment crashed down all at once. Years of restraint, discipline, and silent endurance pressed against the surface. Not as anger, but as resolve. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to defend himself the way they expected. The truth alone was enough. It stood taller than every lie spoken against him. The room felt exposed, stripped of its certainty. What had once seemed like a routine case now carried consequences no one had prepared for. The realization spread slowly but relentlessly. This wasn't just about misconduct. It was about accountability, about a system that had revealed itself under pressure. Asterisk, as the gravity of who he truly was settled in, the balance of power shifted completely. And just before the full weight of that revelation landed, one question lingered in the silence: what happens when the people who enforce the law are finally forced to face it themselves? The outcome of the case arrived quietly, without celebration or spectacle. The accusations collapsed under their own weight once the truth could no longer be ignored. Reports were revisited. Actions were scrutinized. What had once been brushed aside as routine suddenly demanded answers. The officers who had mocked and dismissed him were no longer untouchable. Their certainty gave way to consequences, and for the first time, the system was forced to look at itself. For him, the moment brought no sense of victory, only clarity. He walked away knowing that his position had protected him in ways countless others would never experience. If someone with his authority, his record, and his reach could be reduced to a stereotype in a courtroom, what chance did an ordinary man have? The realization stayed with him long after the case ended, heavier than the humiliation itself. The incident reshaped how he saw the work ahead. It wasn't enough to believe in justice from a distance. Change demanded confrontation, exposing the blind spots, the unchecked power, and the quiet biases that thrived behind procedure and silence. What happened to him wasn't an anomaly. It was a glimpse into a reality many lived every day, without cameras, without accountability, and without recourse. The impact rippled outward. Policies were reviewed. Internal conversations were forced into the open. Some called it progress. Others called it damage control. But the truth was undeniable. The system only responded once it realized who it had targeted. That fact alone spoke volumes. His story became a reminder that racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smirks. Sometimes it hides behind paperwork and professionalism. Sometimes it wears a uniform and assumes immunity. And too often it only backs down when it miscalculates who it's dealing with. But the deeper question remained unanswered. How many people never get that moment of reversal? How many lives are quietly reshaped by humiliation, fear, and injustice that never makes headlines? For every story that ends with accountability, there are countless others that end in silence. This wasn't just his story. It was a mirror held up to a system that still struggles to see people before stereotypes. And it leaves us with a choice to look away once the moment passes, or to demand better before the next name is added to the list. Because justice shouldn't depend on who you are behind closed doors. It should depend on what's right.